And so those joining in late can get a copy, share it with your colleagues. Thank you again to everybody for joining us live today on a live discussion and webinar with two of our esteemed panelists, Erin Bath from Balfour Beatty and Paul Noonan from United Airlines, and of course, hosted in partnership with CloudNine. And moderating the discussion today will be Rick Clark, VP of Strategic Partnerships. So today's mission possible, bridging the gap across compliance, risk management, information governance, and eDiscovery. My name is Kim Tran, head of marketing here at Gimmal, and super excited to host everybody. So just a quick walkthrough of our agenda. We are making things super interactive today. So again, if you missed it earlier, if you're just trickling in, welcome, welcome. Please feel free to drop in the chat where you're dialing in from. We have someone all the way from Ghana, and I myself am out here in the DC metro area, and our panelists are just kind of spread out as well. So we will have the discussion for the first half of today's webinar and then transition into live Q&A. And so thank you to those who submitted questions ahead of time. We have just about 10 or so, but we definitely want to make time as well for anyone to have Q&A live, especially if someone is talking about a topic near and dear to your heart or top of mind for you as we go into 2024. We'd love for you to feel free to ask about it. Of course, not everything can be addressed in an hour as much as we'd love to. And so definitely please keep in touch. We will be hosting more webinars. We'll be at upcoming shows. October is a heavy conference season. And of course, our panelists are also on LinkedIn as well. So there are many ways to stay connected. Just a little bit about Gimmal and CloudNine, especially if you're new to either of us. Gimmal is Information Governance Simplified. We are the market's only end-to-end information governance solutions platform. So everything across the full lifecycle from discovery to classification to migration, as well as remediation and management. CloudNine is our partner. Together we cover both sides of the EDRM model. And they are an eDiscovery platform with self-service, processing, analysis, review, and production for both traditional and modern data. And so without further ado, I wanted to introduce our moderator and panelists today, hosting in partnership with CloudNine and moderating today's discussion is Rick Clark, VP of Strategic Partnerships at CloudNine, Paul Noonan, Managing Counsel of eDiscovery and Information Governance at United Airlines. Welcome, Paul. Thank you. And Erin Bath in the flesh and not just an AI picture, which I will need for 2024, I feel, just to get on thread. National Director of Litigation Management at Balfour Beatty. So thank you all for being here today. And Rick, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it, Kim. And really, thank you both for joining me today, Erin and Paul. It's been great because I've had you on panels before, so this will be fantastic. So Rick Clark, I'm with CloudNine by way of acquisition, had started the company ESI Analyst back in 2018. That was all around the management of modern data. So that's been my focus, but I've been in the industry since 2002, started the master's conferences, and been on the tech side really since 2006. So that's me. And Paul?
Hi, so I am you can see my title up there. I'm not going to read it again, but I've been with United Airlines for about 3 years now. Joined in the middle, actually right at the start of the pandemic, which is always a great time to join an airline, but it's been a great experience, fantastic place to work. I've been in eDiscovery or something adjacent to it generally for about 18 years. I generally work for large corporations. I've worked for General Motors and Sears Holdings Corporation in the past. I have worked for various eDiscovery vendors off and on in between. I'm on this panel primarily because I'm very interested in sort of the marriage of eDiscovery and information governance and how they should work together.
Yeah, that's great. Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Bath. I'm based in Dallas, Texas. I've did my first 10 years working for big law firms in Dallas and New York, and enjoyed that process and then shifted into in-house roles with various companies. I've been with Balfour Beatty now for about 7 years, and they're a large construction infrastructure company based out of London with a big U.S. footprint. And so my role is I oversee litigation for the company, claims issues, and I have a academic background in machine learning and AI. And so a big part of my role is the integration of technology into our legal processes. Now, I don't have as strong a background as Rick or Paul, the info governance side of things, but it's interesting kind of to see how those impact downstream litigation outcomes and considerations, and look forward to participating in good discussion.
All right, so let's dive in here. As you saw in the description when you signed up for this, we're really talking today about the rapidly evolving data landscape. And we have found all on this call, and probably many of you here have found that it has immediate and expensive impacts on litigation. And organizations face increasing challenges related to litigation, discovery, and compliance, risk management, and information governance. So there is a lot to cover here today, but what we're really going to hone in on is the effective coordination and collaboration between various departments and how crucial they are for successful litigation outcomes and cost mitigation. So setting up these proper policies and procedures with IG has the desired downstream effects when litigation arises, but so the opposite is true. So if we don't have good policies in place, there will be challenges down the road. Now, I work in mainly eDiscovery, so I'm used to jumping in the fast lane, especially with modern data, because most are still putting together those policies and practices. And so when, hair's on fire, this is the big bet the farm case, and they've been kicking the can on Slack or cell phones. Those are the places where I jump into this. So as I mentioned, lots to cover. But first, Paul, give us, and actually Aaron, do the same. I'd love, as sort of a continuation of your introduction, why this topic is important to you, and what are some of the first immediate things that interested you to do this today?
All right. So I think this really interests me because in previous places of employment, the information governance and the discovery realms have really not talked to each other as that much. They've often been, kind of just siloed, or not even siloed, but just not even thinking about each other more than anything. And I really like the sort of the team and the infrastructure we built here that does hold them together, because they do have such a huge impact on one another. And making sure that your goals are aligned between information governance and what does happen in litigation is really, really important, because it comes very frequently. People in the business will want to keep things a different length of time than risk management and litigation will. There will be federal rules. There will be laws that you're subject to that impact how long you can keep things or dispose of things. And it's good to be aligned completely on message when you go out into the company, when you put together compliance training, as to what your goals are in maintaining all the information in the company. And just to kind of set the table on how I really view this, and we're a Microsoft shop, and I'll talk about in Microsoft terms a lot, but if you're not, it's usually applicable to other places as well. But on information governance, I kind of view this as a sort of a 3-step or kind of 3-rule process, which is you'll have the ability to enforce retention or deletion in some instances. You'll have the opportunity to recommend or prescribe retention or deletion in some instances. And then you need to balance those with your legal hold process to make sure that anything that is subject to automatic deletion or retention complies with your legal hold obligations. And I think that's sort of the lens I start with in terms of how we go about, attacking what we want to keep, what we want to get rid of, and the communication strategies around those to the rest of the company.
Yeah, Aaron.
Yeah, that is a really good overview. For me, it's a little bit more close to home right now, just because our company is going through the process of developing a new records retention schedule. And so somebody without a background in InfoGov, it's been a real learning process, right? To kind of see what we've had in place and why it needs to be revised and why it needs to be modernized. And who's the best to address that, right? Who's the best to come in and give advice around that InfoGov space? Is it lawyers? Is it consultants? Is it, software companies? Come to find out there's lots of ways to get good traction in that space. But yeah, my experience working in-house for companies, even big companies, is the expertise has been kind of soft in InfoGov, right? It kind of sits under legal, it kind of sits under IT. You know, IT looks for legal for certain direction, which they should, right? There's laws that apply, and vice versa. Then we got the infrastructure to deal with. And to Paul's point, it's been really a complicated process in that, yes, there's policies that you have to develop and have, but then what, right? How do you act on those policies? How do you execute them? Where do they plug in? How do they impact the tools that you're using in terms of deletion, preservation, and just overall management, looking for redundancy? So it's an area for me I'm interested in learning more about. I love working on the eDiscovery side of my litigation docket. That's something I love to spend a lot of time. And so I'm kind of learning as I go about how that interfaces with our various systems and policies and how they could be made better. So for me, it's an opportunity to learn and grow like all of you.
That's great, Aaron. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. Let's talk information governance. So Paul, you mentioned while at the Masters Conference in Chicago, the need to have your eDiscovery and data governance strategy linked. And you commented that there would be both risk and cost ramifications if you do not tie the two efforts together. I thought that was fantastic. So question is, what have you seen that is growing in challenges with information governance amidst all of the growing communication channels?
So the COVID pandemic in particular, I think, was kind of a sea change for discovery, but also for information governance simultaneously. And I'm going to just put on my eDiscovery hat for a second to set this up so that I'm going to bob back and forth. But pre-pandemic, especially with the ubiquity of Microsoft amongst a lot of corporations, I feel like we kind of had eDiscovery conquered and solved to a large extent for a large period of time. We had to worry about the suites, the Office suite, the Outlook suite, and most business communications took place there. Most documentation took those forms and was saved in places we knew how to get to, and in folders we knew how to access and how to deal with. And then the pandemic comes along, and everybody has to go home, and those methods of communication and document storage suddenly become a lot less useful and a lot less ubiquitous. People need to be able to contact each other in real time while in a remote environment. And, a lot of people have been doing this a long time. So Slack starts to take off. And if people who are out in the field, text messages become much more frequent than they ever have. Apps like WhatsApp, which is the basically standard chat platform for most of the world, becomes ubiquitous as well. And along with all of that's just a taste of it. But along with all of those, the ways that employees communicate with each other and store data suddenly explode into a bunch of different programs that we don't have centralized control over, that we don't necessarily have a good ability to collect through some centralized location. And it takes a newfangled policy development, new strategy, new data mapping, which I hate with a passion, to get a handle on all of this. But it's something that needed to happen. The other thing that we ran into a lot, and I know a lot of people did, is a lot more gets recorded now than used to. Like with people doing Teams meetings all the time, when you meet in a room, nobody's whipping out a phone and recording the meeting on their phone. But with doing meetings on Teams and on Zoom, suddenly you have the ability to record every single interaction that you have with a company, unless the company decides to turn it off for a lot of people, which I will remain agnostic on here, but I don't like recording things. So other than webinars. And so this is an information governance problem, and it needs to have policy prescriptions on the best channels to do business on, the channels that should not contain business. And it needs to be employee friendly too, because if you make a prescription that someone should use a program that is not friendly, they will not use it and they'll find a way around it. And from a litigation point perspective, a lot of these repositories are much more difficult to collect, much more difficult to process, and much more difficult to put into a usable form, especially quickly. And so you need to come together with your InfoGov people, or be them, and start to make a policy that makes employees happy, but also doesn't have you grabbing from 30 different sources every single lawsuit that occurs. So, and that's what we've been doing for the last few years. And I think we have a good, fairly employee-friendly, streamlined version. Do stuff every day, so I won't be, I won't claim to be the saint here, but if you don't do that, you could very well end up, grabbing from a repository for the very first time every case. And I'll tell you, the first time you do something is always the most expensive and always the biggest. So I think that's the big challenge out of COVID is realize that there are all these new repositories and communication tools, develop policies around them, and do take a realistic view at it, because you do want something that your employees are going to use and not be fighting to push them into something that they don't.
Absolutely agree. Aaron, did you have anything to add there, or do you still want to wait for the eDiscovery?
Yeah, those were all great points, and it resonated because we had a very similar process going through COVID, where we ended up with a lot new tools that were utilized at a different pace, and even we made strategic business decisions to go with different software solutions for our construction efforts that were new, and there what we realize is a big gap in expertise when it comes to collection. How do you get the data out of there, right?
Yep.
So that's where we really started having to do a lot of proactive theoretical exercises of like, although this hasn't happened yet, this is coming, and we don't want to have a 6-month delay in figuring out how to respond to these discovery requests, right? So we had to work with outside experts and LSPs to really help us figure out how to crack the code, and that's a big resource drain, right? So it was actually budgeting time and budgeting people and dedicating them to things that we don't need yet, but we got to figure out, and trying to get ahead of it, and realizing we got to look for outside help, right? So that was our big kind of take from it as well.
Yeah, that's great. And Paul, one of the things we talked about when we were planning for this is, tools in the toolbox, right? So you outlined 3 that you found to be very helpful from a sort of organization perspective, but would love to hear your perspective on what tools that you can have.
Okay, so just tools wise, when you're putting your policy together, you want to think about what your abilities are and what you may be able to go out and grab to do this as well. But I think if you are a Microsoft shop, you do kind of start with the suite still, because if nothing else, they do offer good networking remote alternatives with Teams. I know people don't always love Teams, and Teams is better at some of its abilities than others. But you do have the ability to still set central policy there. And to the extent that there's a lot of chat going on within the company, you want to have a good understanding of the types of conversations that still lend themselves to email that happen in chat, and an understanding of how much business is happening over chat and how much colloquial conversation, water cooler stuff is also happening over chat and mingling, and an understanding of the channel messages that are there too, and setting, I would say, enforced retention on that. And get to part 1 of what I said earlier. Within the Microsoft suite, you can set enforced retention on email, on chats, actually kind of on the whole thing. And I would say, generally speaking, I'm very pro that. I'm very pro defensible deletion whenever you have the ability to do that, and that's part of the litigation hat. I've been at conferences where I've run into people who have a similar job to me, where their view is you should keep as much as possible, where they get bailed out with older information on lawsuits more than they get hammered with old information. Your experience may differ from mine, but that's not my experience. In my experience, the older the information that you have around, the less context it has. Like, people move on, people join other companies. The people that had those conversations aren't around to provide context in depositions. And you end up also just collecting a lot of junk, because you can't tell whether it's good or not anymore. And so part 1, I would say, is you want it to work within the tools you have to put some enforced retention on that with a good legal hold backstop to mitigate that. And we have the tools to do that now. It requires some attention to detail, but these things all work together. The API environment is very robust, and I try to be agnostic in terms of vendors on these sorts of things, but tying together a good policy with a good legal hold tool isn't that hard, with backstops available. On the subject of sort of prescribed retention, there's going to be databases, folders, etc., outside of centralized control that aren't built for eDiscovery, that don't have retention capabilities built in. And I think, to go back to the information governance hat for a second, this is where it can be very helpful to tie together sort of education, enforcement of your retention policies, and also sort of building bridges and gaining allies within your business. And the one thing I would recommend on that front is to have within each business unit, whatever, how your company might be bigger than mine, and this might be more difficult, but I think it's good to deputize like one person within each business unit as sort of your single point of contact for records management. And that way you can cascade messaging down. You can conduct quarterly or biannual reviews of what records maybe need to be purged. You can send down updates based on federal and state and whatever laws that come through to those people, and they can circulate it. And it doesn't take, then it's not like a mass blast to the whole company that's going to be largely ignored. And, if you make it easy on those business units and you have a good relationship with those people, the prescribed retention will have a much better chance of actually being implemented than if you sort of just rely on, it's time to, emails to the whole company where it's time to look at everything and delete everything for a little. That doesn't work. You need to have relationships there to make that part of it work. So that's where I go with the prescribed one. I have a set schedule of business record review with those record coordinators within the business. You go to them on a set regular basis. You check in. It brings it to top of mind. You get data back on whether there's new record categories or maybe changes to the law that they have picked up in the business, and you can record that in your central repository for record retention schedule, which you should have.
Absolutely. So enforced retention, recommended or prescribed retention, and integrated legal hold. So
Yes.
That's really, really great. Thank you, Paul. In the interest of time, and also, by the way, thank you all for submitting your questions. So Q&A is going to be coming up here very soon. If you have questions during any of this, please ask live. We will answer some of them live as well. But let's talk eDiscovery. Okay, so as stated, having the house in order upstream or left of the EDRM will positively impact downstream internal investigations or litigation. So let's take a look at the discovery process and its dependencies on information governance. And now we're also we talked earlier about modern data being incorporated into investigations and litigation now pretty rapidly. Aaron, what do you recommend as some first steps in incorporating this data into discovery? Like, where do we begin? There's a new litigation event. Where do we start?
I think everything, first of all, pressing pause and making sure that you give some thought and have communication with internal clients, different departments, making sure you understand the body of players at stake, right? So preservation is always top of mind whenever anything comes in. So, something comes in, stop, have conversations with people involved, build out your knowledge debt, and start documenting. Regardless of where you keep the information, there's so much information, whether you keep it in an ELM or a matter management system, or if you have a dedicated tool, start taking notes and log everything. Obviously the legal hold process is first and foremost something you got to be very quick to respond. You got to make sure you're complying to law with written notice and that you're tracking the right kind of acknowledgments to that. And once you kind of cover those bases, then it's endpoints. Where does data reside? And that can be a function of the legal hold tool. I really, really like the functionality a lot of modern tools have of doing questionnaires. But sometimes nothing takes the place of having a conversation, right? Knocking on a door and having to talk. And I find I can often get a lot more actionable information with a 2-minute face-to-face conversation than I can sending a bunch of questionnaires that people don't want to take the time to answer and that you got to chase down answers to. So the human element of investigations and kind of building out your web can't be overstated. And then you move into collections, right? And that's an area where, we haven't, frankly, to this point, and you've spent a lot of time and effort looking into bringing collections in-house. I think that's kind of next on my map. But once we get, data into a tool and we can start to segment it, that's where, like for me, the investment in machine learning and understanding how to segregate and organize and label our data really, really helps us to get to understanding our facts and our position and our risk a lot quicker, rather than 6-8 months down the road when we've exchanged documents with the other side. It's the speed to insight for me, which is the most valuable aspect of managing discovery for this company or any other.
Yeah, Paul, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, collection has become, I think, an increasingly large portion of the cost of any litigation. Forever, sort of the default has always been the review that, paying contractors is far and away the largest part of it. But just with the advancements in TAR and AI on the right side of the DRM, I feel like that's getting less and less true. And what really does drive cost is just over retention and honestly risk too, because the more you have saved on the back end, the more likely it is some random bad document gets in there, maybe not even related to the case. It just the more stuff you collect, the more stuff gets through. That's just sort of the basic math of the thing. And so having a good robust deletion policy, again, when you're not on hold, when it is in compliance with the retention schedule that you've set, it is really helpful to just cut down on that big mountain at the left side of the DRM when you do collections. I also do feel like it is a good idea, generally speaking, to move this in-house. Not everybody's going to have the resources to do everything in-house, but even if you don't have the resources to do sort of giant cases, you can probably get the resources to do a lot of the high volume, smaller cases. And anybody who is a Microsoft shop will have access to Compliance Center, at least even at the E3 level. You can still do halfway decent work in there, which is, by the way, what I am saddled with. So I always mention that. If you have the E5, you can do a lot more, and good on you for that. But on the sort of increasing ubiquity of having to do phone collections, that's always a fight. Nobody likes to give up their phone. And if you take just a little bit of that in-house as well, you can provide a little bit better service and get a little bit better compliance by, showing up at somebody's office during a 2-hour meeting and grabbing their phone and hopefully getting it done in time for that. That is very helpful for maintaining phone preservation and for getting collections done. And I think the more you can do in-house, first of all, even if you can't do everything, you can always find somebody to help you scale up for some big emergency case that's going to be out there for you. Like, vendors will be tripping over themselves to offer you that service. There's no reason not to have at least some level of collectionability for doing PC images, for doing phone images, and for doing sort of just the basic email and file collection. And doing that at a base level will end up saving you a lot of time and money on the front end by just giving you some ability to control that, have some control over the date culling that happens and being able to push back on that. And even some search term ability, even on the front end, even if you don't have like a processing tool. So I would say own that up front. And that will also help you to understand and dig into where those repositories are and where people with information are, if you actually have the tools to interact with them.
Absolutely agree with both of you. And so my quick contribution here on the sort of ECA review stage of this, I have found, let's just focus specifically on Slack Teams, chat messages, right? I have found that, the industry does standardize a lot on documents, but we're finding more and more that as volumes grow, you have 80 million Slack messages. Do you convert all those to documents first and then review it all? Probably not, right? With technology and also Paul and Aaron, easy processes in collecting that data, right? So like the Celebrites, the Mode Ones of the world have started to make that easier for teams to do their own collections. But then actually taking that data and looking at it in a near native way. So think Clearwell back in the day, how they just leveraged indexes and culled down vast hordes of email. Well, you could do the same with all of your modern short message communications. Pull that all down, review it, get it ready for final review, and then produce it all out, right? That's my quick contribution there. But I do want to ask a question before we segue very quickly into Q&A. Are you seeing conversations migrating from one platform to another? Meaning we start a conversation in email, switch over to Slack or Teams or something. Maybe it's on our device, or then to text message or a 30-minute phone call. Are you seeing that sort of cross platform communication happening in your companies?
I could take it first, Aaron. But,
Sure.
I see it all the time, and it is very, very frequent for employees to be having a conversation within their chats and then to flip over to email for maybe the deliverable, maybe to offer an official communication to a fourth party who's not involved in the chat, and then go back to it. And there will be a lot of context in those chats from that, relating to that email, where sure, you might have the deliverable on part A, but that might not be the most important part of what you're doing, especially if it's more of an investigation or something along those lines, versus just responding to a discovery request. And if you can't put those two together, you're going to be missing a lot of context. And that just kind of how people work now. People are always conversing with each other via some method, and email isn't that method most of the time. Most of the time, email is, hey boss, here's what we did, and then checking out. So I feel like you miss a lot if you don't have a sort of broad protocol for viewing these in the context with which they should be viewed.
Yeah, it's a good point. And tacking onto that, there's a lot of enterprise specific software that has non-obvious chat functionality that we see getting leveraged, right? So obvious places, looking at a Slack or a Teams situation, or text messages, but inside of the tools that you use for your day-to-day work, construction platforms, right? A lot of them have areas for people to chat informally, and the tendency is you get quicker responses if you go through the channel versus sending an email that gets buried in an inbox, right? So it does tend to be a very, very heavy usage. And I agree with Paul. I often hear the deliverable going through the email. So the formal thing, but where's all the meat that makes up the decision process? How do you show your work? It's buried inside of a tool that you might not even know has chat functionality, right? So you got to be very, very aware and do those exercises to figure out how to access those chats in that non-native software.
Fantastic. So we'll segue now into Q&A. As we pull the screen back up, there was one here from the audience that I found great, and from Ya. What point will it be necessary to anonymize data? Do you find that to be important throughout the process here?
So it depends a lot on the context of what it's being used for, but it is often critical. I run into it on a fairly regular basis. I suspect anybody who works for a corporation that has a large customer database will run into that at some point if they haven't already. They probably have already. And so it's already crucial in many contexts. And having a developed process for that anonymization, and also for de-anonymization in many aspects, or having a process where you won't need to do that because you keep good track of stuff, is really, really important, and frankly kind of hard to do. I also, like I'm sure everybody thinks, as privacy continues to grow in its influence on how we handle data, for better and for worse, anonymization will probably continue to become a bigger deal as well. And as the rights of consumers start to continue to sort of break off from the rights of the companies that serve them, I suspect it's going to become a bigger deal over time. I feel like eDiscovery software is pretty on top of this at this point. A lot of them do a good job. A lot of databases generally do a good job at this. But yeah, it's a big deal that you definitely have to pay attention to.
Yeah, and with the influx, of course, with generative AI plugging into every tool that we use in the legal space, and almost becoming non-optional with some of the releases coming out with, Westlaw and eDiscovery tools and things like that. We've got to be really careful about thinking about a term called mechanistic interpretability, right? What does it refer to come up with its answers, and is that data being scraped to train the model? And there's tools out there like data mask and anonymization tools that can kind of help when you're working in that domain. But you really want to make sure that you have people with real expertise that are providing insight as to what's becoming public and what might be a privacy risk. Because frankly, honestly, there's a lot of eDiscovery professionals talking about GAI in ways that are not accurate, that are actively giving bad advice because they're comfortable talking about technology, even though they don't necessarily understand the tech in this space. So it's going to become a much more prevalent concern.
Yeah, and everyone stick around. We have a lot of great questions that you probably might be having as well. So first here, Regina, thank you so much for submitting this. Standard operation procedures vary widely. Do you have any recommendations or best practices, tips that should be considered?
It's a broad question. So
yeah. On my end, I was going to say, just kind of briefly, gamification and training and getting it in front of people's eyes. There's so many companies that have policies that it's a very complicated process to find a playbook on a intraweb website, and nobody really knows where to go. And it's nice to have communication that links to it and maybe does some kind of educational component. I really like to see that to kind of help people at least know where to go, where the resources are found. But in terms of building one, Paul probably has some great advice on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In some capacity, you'll probably have a database of varying sophistication on sort of your general retention schedule and where data generally lies. And in terms of standard operating procedure, I would just assume that no one's going to find it on their own, that nobody's going to ever care enough to do that. And so you do need sort of a tree of influence through your business, that when somebody does have the random question, or when you do need to enforce some part of it, that there is a methodology for communicating that down. And it basically almost like a shadow structure that, okay, this needs to be communicated to this business unit. This is our single point of contact there. We'll give it to them, and they will spread it to whoever it needs to be spread to. And then we'll check on them later to make sure that actually the enforcement actually happened or the education actually happened. It's not easy to get into a large corporation's compliance training. Those things are stuffed to the gills, and they grow every year with things that are mandated by the law. It's hard to just squeak in some information governance compliance training that's not mandated by the law. So you really need to be your own advocate and your own evangelist for it. And so having that sort of structure on knowing who to communicate to get it through the business is the best way to do it. Set up that tree and have your database accessible to the person who you order to look at it.
Very great. Next question is from Laura. And what was your communication cadence to onboard senior managers, and how do you share lessons learned to stakeholders?
Let's see. Communications to onboard senior managers. So first of all, in this space, most senior managers and higher ups generally, I feel like while they don't care about this, are on board with having a pretty robust information governance policy and like deletion policy. And it's a pretty easy sell a lot of the time. Most are concerned with the risk of having data around too long. I would say the best way to get approval to communicate up the stream here is kind of generally good advice with communicating with senior managers, which is to have your process built out to a large extent already, and a good elevator, clear communication speech on how it works. Presenting that, you may get some little critiques or things they want changed, but the robustness of the policy and the process will be the best selling point, especially if you can fit it on 4 PowerPoint slides. So that's and once they saw how much work we had done on building out our policy, it really was an easy sell. It was that looks great. Run with that. Let me know if there's any problems.
Yeah, I agree. Going up is one thing, going down is another. We always look for business opportunities to present to our teams to kind of train and educate and update. So like in the construction space, whenever we kick off a new project and build a new thing, there's a sales to delivery meeting where the entire team gets together and talks, and we cover everything from safety practices, right? And one area when we get into legal is always talking about the data, right? What are our standards? Where are things kept? What are the email etiquette policies? Like all those kind of discussions around it. And because of that repetition of doing it over and over again, right? And getting the feedback from the team of where that falls apart, right? It becomes iterative and gets better and more solid, and provides insight that we can then report up for us. We do annual executive meetings where we kind of report the lessons learned from the various projects. And that's kind of how our cycle works.
Excellent. Next one's from Deborah. What trends and risks are you seeing with the use of various social media platforms for marketing and sales? Are you finding any of those challenges with litigation or even information governance?
I'm going to let Aaron go first on the next one. I keep jumping in too early. On marketing through social media, I feel like we actually have a pretty robust policy. We don't run into too many issues with it. I think everybody does kind of so the problem I hear about all the time with this is employees jumping in whether they shouldn't. And I actually don't feel like that happens as much as people say it does. But you do want to have a good understanding that these are communication platforms, that there are likely like customer interactions occurring on Facebook and Twitter. I'm not calling it X, and anything else where people feel free to complain about the service that they've received or anything else. And having a good cadence of okay, a complaint comes in here, it gets escalated to our preferred channel, is generally speaking a good idea. But you do want to understand that it's likely you'll have to collect off of these platforms at some point, and you do want to have a process for it, and a retention policy for it as well, because if you don't, things will linger for quite a while until those platforms decide they shouldn't. Also important for hold purposes, because you may need to go grab things unknowing how long they're going to actually stick around on those platforms.
And for us, we like you, Paul, we don't really have a big issue with personal social media use. For us, there's a lot of education, and I think our managers and VPs and SVPs do a really good job of this. Of whenever there's something that we want to highlight or communicate on social media for one of our employees, maybe we're speaking on a panel, right? And we want to communicate that on a LinkedIn or some other social media. It's always directed through our communications team, and it always goes to them, and they have the oversight of making sure that we're on brand with graphics and language, and that we don't disclose anything that's out of turn, right? So bringing in the right people to have shepherd and oversight that process is really valuable, and empowering your managers to engage marketing and communications to make sure that's on point.
Okay, next one, and I know we could go, we could have a whole session on just this, on privacy, but there's about 6 more questions left. So Aaron, why don't you kick us off here? How would you balance privacy and accessibility in the cloud?
So I'll be honest, this is probably a better one for Paul. I really don't have a background in privacy. So it's something I'd have to defer to experts like you guys on, to be honest.
You can take the next one.
Yeah.
So honestly, I mean, I don't really have I work with privacy a lot. It's not my area of expertise, to be sure. However, the cloud isn't fundamentally that different than pre-cloud data storage was, other than it's somebody else's servers instead of your own. But that's been the case for a long time. And this really falls into your data security realm more than it does into eDiscovery or information governance, in just making sure that there are no rogue cloud accessories or programs out there, that everything has been vetted, that everything is under the preferred blanket of whatever single sign-on practice you have or firewall practice you have, and that there's nothing's being communicated over unapproved cloud databases that lack the security that you prefer. It really just comes down to that, and it's just an extra step on leveraging the robust nature of the cloud servers that are out there versus your on-prem. But it's fundamentally not that different. You just have to log in a different way, and you got to make sure that your security is up to snuff when you do that.
Aaron, I know you've got this one because you have lots of great opinions, and I've heard this one in particular. What is the single most disruptive thing you would think will hit the profession in the next 5 years?
You're going to be generative AI, right? I just think about from a rules of evidence perspective of authentication and how that's going to play out in the courts, and of course the misuse and the abuse. And everybody speaking as an expert that don't even understand the downstream impact of the types of models and the type of grounding that these models have in our data sets and our legal authority. And obviously it's going to get more and more advanced as we go along. And it's the big thing for me is it's not going to be optional, right? It's going to be baked into every tool that we use. Legal research, legal writing, eDiscovery. It's already baked into a lot of legal operations tools. So it's not going to be anything we can avoid, but disruptive in both ways. Disruptive in terms of it's going to cause a lot of headache and discussion and having to come together and figure out new rules, but also disruptive in terms that it'll change the way that we approach the practice of law and defensive cases and all of that.
Yep, it's that easily. And you should already be considering having policies for AI, both from a business perspective, especially on anything involving IP creation. Again, not my area of expertise, but would recommend that. But just eDiscovery in particular is going to be the area where it becomes ubiquitous within corporations and legal departments. We've already been using a form of it for a long time, not generative, but it's going to be baked into every tool you can possibly use very, very shortly. Already is in some instances. Aaron is also correct through a lot of the other operational tools that exist already. And I also feel like we haven't really come to grips with a lot of the issues around exactly how the learning takes place, what it does scrape, what it integrates back into whatever cloud source it's based on. We could go on for that. I'm probably forever. Aaron more competently than me. But yeah, it's that. It's easily generative AI without question.
So the next question is in that same vein, right? So how do you best protect client confidences using generative AI?
Yeah. So again, don't ask your eDiscovery professionals on what you want to do, because they're not trained in this, right? You want to learn from data scientists that understand the inner workings of different kind of models. Like right now, people's idea of GAI is Chat GPT, and that is not to say it's a toy, but it is definitely limited in scope and inputs and outputs versus enterprise grade LLMs and other multimodal transformer models that are out there that businesses are using at an enterprise class. They are much more sophisticated tools. And in terms of, I guess, protecting confidences, some things you could do, if you've got enough resources, you could think about local processing. You could enter into contractual agreements with your, whatever company you're licensing the AI model from in terms of disclosure, in terms of data anonymization. Those are some. You also don't want to just feed sensitive information inside of the model, right? Think about how you want to input data in a way that doesn't put your secret sauce out there in the cloud to be scraped. Training and communication. Actually learn about transformer models and what they're doing to your data and how they work and how they're different than classification and what we've been using in eDiscovery for a long time, right? So I think it's knowledge and asking the right people, learning about the grounding of these models and how that works, so that it is based on not just the fear of hallucination, but it's actually basing its answers on real data sets and real information. So yeah, a lot of things to be learned out there from experts.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
do what Aaron said. I would say just most attorneys that I've run into, at least, if they encounter foreign language documents, will not just put it into Google Translate, because then it becomes part of Google. And I think that general sort of rule of thumb is a good one. If you don't know where your data is going, don't put it in there. And if you want to put it in there, you're going to need to figure out what is actually happening on the back end.
That's a really good analogy. Yeah.
Perfect. Yep. Okay, there's 3 left. Getting back to information governance here, can you and I know you talked a bit about this, Paul, already, but can you recommend a template of compliance best practices to use as a starting point when initiating an IG program?
If you're starting from scratch, there are quite a few services out there that will get you started with a good database, and that even has plugins around giving you some rules that may apply to the types of documents that you have in your company and whether you have to keep them or not. But I would just start with, generally speaking, just sort of doing a survey of the business units in your company about the types of data that they have, the retention that they prefer from a business perspective, and then putting together a program where you either bring in some help or a database or consultants or do it yourself in figuring out if there's anything overarching that should be governing that, and any rules and regulations that you are subject to. And you probably know that if you're in a business that's subject to regulations, it's usually the first thing they tell you when you walk in the door. But start building it up by tracking and track the data types, where they live in business units, and sort of build up from there. In terms of just best practices, start with prescribed retention policies before you get into actually enforcing them, because you'll want an idea of what your business's sort of culture is, what the restrictions are, what the rules are around it, before you go and just pop something on that's too short or maybe even too long.
Yeah. Second to last question here from Scott. What are some key steps to establish a COE for governance?
I'm just gonna.
Yeah, please.
I don't know the acronym off the top of my head.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep. Fair enough. But we might come back to that. Scott, I see you're still here. If you can maybe just do a quick note on what you're asking here.
I was trying to Google it in the background and it didn't work, so I got
Okay, so Patrick, you kind of stole a little bit of my thunder here. No, just
Center
kidding.
of excellence. He popped in.
Yep, I saw that. So let's go back then to that, and then the last thing we'll do here is what's a big key takeaway. And so here we go. So going back, it's what are some key steps to establishing a center of excellence for governance?
It's a big question, and I kind of feel like I've outlined it at a high level from at least my point of view already. But you do want to have essentially a centralized both repository of information governance guidelines and timelines. You want to have a unified vision of exactly what your goals are in keeping and deleting data, and you want to establish a structure throughout your company for communicating those wishes, enforcing the guidelines, and also just evangelizing them as well, and being able to gather feedback from the business too. That's really what it comes down to. That there's of course a million little tiny steps you have to do in that to make it actually happen, but if you have that structure in place and you actually go out into the field and talk to people, that's what people usually find the hardest. All of the recording and sending out to the chain you establish isn't that hard. You got to make the relationships in the first place, and that's the big step you have to overcome.
Yeah, and then getting buy-in from the key stakeholders. Yeah, that's perfect. All right, big takeaways. What can we leave the audience with here? If there was one key item you'd like to leave the audience with, what would it be?
Yeah, we've talked about a lot of different things. One thing we haven't really talked about necessarily is subject matter experts and staffing. And, I think about, a legal department, we have a lot of different talents and personalities and roles on a legal team, right? And who's good at what and who's responsible for what, right? Do we have paralegals going into O365 and executing discovery processes there? Should we be going through, another tool that has controls? When you think about consistency, I always think communication is the most important technology on a legal team, and being able to kind of communicate and delineate responsibility. So I would say this, in terms of thinking through governance and the eDiscovery process, you want to have conversations, you want to assess your team, you want to assess their strengths, and you want to make sure you have the right people doing the right things. I don't want somebody that's not necessarily technically minded to be working as a project manager, eDiscovery wise. That's not going to be a good fit. Where do they fit in? What can they do? And kind of building out your team and processes that way based on position and who's right at what role.
Yeah. I think for mine, it's that it can be difficult to communicate the benefits of having a defensible destruction policy, and it can itself seem risky if you don't have a robust enough process to actually handle doing it in compliance with your legal hold policy. But it's really a good idea because the cost of storage keeps going down, and it's tempting to just keep everything. People are actually kind of used to keeping everything in their personal, like Gmails and things like that. Yeah. But as that growth accelerates, especially amongst many platforms of communication, the math really does start to work against you pretty quickly in being able to actually collect it and force it over an FTP or the internet into a production tool, which then actually has to work pretty hard to work through all that data. And yeah, speeds increase there too. But yeah, you have kind of an exponential versus non-exponential problem happening there. And it really is in your best interest to keep that big glob of data behind the scenes as small as is defensibly possible. If you don't, things are going to start to grow out of control on you pretty quickly.
Yeah. And my takeaway is going to be, I haven't shared much today. You guys have been fantastic, but my big one is the data of today that is impacting investigations and discovery is data, not documents. If you can create a review experience or use a platform that creates a review experience that keeps it near native, may look like documents, right? But you can push data through the production or even the litigation lifecycle, but at least get through the first pass using a different methodology than just a traditional doc review. So Kim, awesome. I will kick it back over to you to close us out here.
Thank you so much to everybody here. And thank you all for joining us live again. And Rick, Aaron, Paul, can't thank you all enough for making time, especially during a busy travel conference season. But speaking of conferences, we will be at ARMA InfoCon right next week, starting on Monday, booth 420. There are rumblings that there's a steamboat party, 70s theme, ARMA International is always putting on a great time for everybody. And of course, also we have new at ARMA this year is a legal track, which is really exciting and relevant to this audience here. Post ARMA InfoCon, we will be heading to Legal Ops in Las Vegas. And then, as Rick mentioned, the Masters conferences in New York, as well as as Atlanta later this month, and then going into November. And so any events or conferences that we should know about for 2024, reach out to us on LinkedIn. All of the panelists are also on LinkedIn. Thank you all again. And then especially thank you for the attendees as well for making time and submitting questions ahead of time. So we will be following up with folks, especially if you were not able to, if you registered but did not attend live, you will be receiving this recording. And if you would like to share it with colleagues, perhaps on some of the insights that were discussed and shared out today, you will be able to do that as well. So thank you again, everybody, and have a great rest of the week and rest of the month.
Thanks,
Awesome.
everyone.
Yep,
Thanks, everyone.
all.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.